Chad, what's up, man? We were just laughing a lot during pre-show. We almost forgot to hit record. So let's let's continue the conversation and have a great episode here. So thanks for joining me today, man.
Yeah, and thanks for having me, man. I'm looking forward to it.
Let's set the stage and provide a little bit of context of who you are, why you're here, and just kind of your journey to professional sports. So, like, what was your origin story, and it brought you to sports, and then eventually led you out of sports?
All right, origin story of what got me into sports. Well, um, there was a long time ago when I thought I took a real stab at trying to play professional soccer, a real modest stab. And before that, I had my undergraduate degrees in computer science and mathematics, and I was programming and doing that stuff. And I was actually doing these things at the same time. I was still working, and I was trying to just train and go to tryouts and do things to try to see if I could make it. And along that journey, I actually went to Athletes Performance, now Exos, and I actually trained there for about a month. And after I left there, I kept doing the trying to play for a little bit, and then I eventually reached a point where I was like, I'm good with this. Like, I don't want to do this anymore. But by going to Athletes Performance, I had realized that that was a job that you could train people. And up until that point, I didn't even realize that it was a possible job that you could have. And I was like, well, that's kind of cool. Like, maybe I should do something like that, because I knew I didn't want to program anymore. And so that eventually just led me down a road. I started personal training, did some stuff at, with high school, collegiate athletes, and then actually came full circle and did an internship at Athletes Performance out in LA, and was doing that and also doing some stuff with the LA Galaxy at the time as well. And I was like, talking to a couple friends, and they were like, you should really check out like trying to work on the team side. And I hadn't, again, these are all things that I had no idea were actually possible. Like they were real jobs. And so just through the course of kind of following dreams and following things that really fascinated me, I wound up in this position where I eventually got a full-time role in Seattle working in soccer. And then from there, I've been in it for like 13, 14 years. And yeah, it was a lot of fun, had a lot of cool experiences. This past November, I actually got let go from the team that I was working for. And since then, I've now transitioned into some other things where it was kind of time for me to move on from pro sports. And yeah, now I'm in a place where I'm kind of exploring some other options, and there's a few things on the table. But yeah, it was a good run of it in pro sports, and that's a little bit of how I ended up in it.
No, I appreciate it, man. I did not realize you were you did a couple internships with the Exos. That's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, that was way back in the day. I was the oldest intern at the Exos. Everyone was like 20, 21, and I think I was 26 at the time.
Nice.
So it was like I was there and I was like really serious. I was like, I'm here because if I don't sort this out, like I don't have any income, I don't have a job, I can't support myself. And everybody else was like a college student where they were just like, oh, I'm just doing like an internship, and they're kind of like whatever. They're like, I'm trying to figure out what I'm doing. So it was like really interesting to be in that because I was all business the whole time.
You gotta make a living. I get it.
Yeah.
Ah, all right. There's a couple different ways we can jump into this episode. So I think we're gonna start with some more practical experience. You do bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to the audience and the listeners. So let's something you and I can both speak at a high level on and have an appreciation for is the return to play process, return to play, return to sport, return to performance, just that process from injury to getting back on the pitch, getting back on the court. So one thing that I think is often overlooked during the return to play process is how do you balance the need to maintain performance qualities while also respecting the need for the injury to recover? Can you speak on this?
Yes. What would I say with that? So I think it's maybe as simple as just saying we're working around the injury. That's the starting point. And now, depending on what the injury is, you can do less, you can do more. But I think the starting point is really just thinking about this local approach and this global approach. And the local approach, in my eyes, would be whatever the injury is, it's a hamstring, it's a knee, it's an ankle, it's whatever. There's something there where you're like, okay, everything that I'm going to do is going to work around that. I'm not going to stress that tissue because I need to honor the natural healing process that's going to happen there. And I need to honor whatever, medical interventions or treatments might be happening there. But then there's this whole other organism. And so that is really like this global approach where the entire rest of this human organism can be trained. You just want to avoid beating the crap out of the thing that's injured. And so I think in that regard, we can continue to work at this sort of global level. And let's take an example. Let's say I have a hamstring injury. That's something that we dealt with a lot in soccer. So there's a whole bunch of things that I can generally do a day or a couple days after someone gets injured. I always have access to do stuff upper body. And then I can think about what can I do with the upper body? Well, I can do, straight up strength training. I can do conditioning circuits, or I can do some other type of like cardiovascular stress. And while that's not the same as them using their legs, I can continue to get load into their body to keep them primed for when they do come back. And I can keep some of those like central adaptations and things like that allow them to transition at the end of their rehab a little bit quicker. And I think that's ultimately what we're trying to do when, if I think back and you think of this sort of global approach to it, is that you're trying to do as much as you can at the beginning, working around that injury to allow the end of the rehab to go a little bit faster, for there to be a little bit more of a quicker ramp up, as opposed to, oh, okay, we're back from injury and now we got to get fit again.
Do you throughout your experience, did you ever run into any pitfalls with that approach of trying to train around it versus letting it just letting it be, right? I've heard that expression, man, just like let it be. Let's just take 7 to 10 days. Let's not worry about anything. Let's just focus on the injured part recovering. What is your perspective on that idea?
I'm trying to think if I've ever had a pitfall with that. I mean, I've definitely been in situations where I think guys have kind of pushed back a little bit and have wanted to do that. They've come from a culture where they were used to, oh, I get injured and I just don't do anything. And so some of it was actually a pushback because from a cultural standpoint, they had always done it one way and we were trying to do it a different way. That was probably like the biggest pushback. But in terms of doing that and having a negative reaction from actually just like working around the injury and doing stuff, I don't remember ever having an issue with it, because you're just really mindful, right? There's a lot of communication between what I would be doing and what someone on the medical side will be doing. Like, it's a constant communication and understanding of like what each of us is doing. There's constant feedback about what I can and can't do. And in that regard, like, I always honored if someone on the medical staff was like, you can't do this, I fully respected and honored that and just didn't do it. And I would always try to find something and usually confirm with them, like, hey, I'm going to do this. Just want to double check. This is not going to interfere with anything. So I don't think there's ever a situation. And I think part of it was because I always took the approach of respecting and honoring the other person who has more jurisdiction over them at that time, and looking at my role more as like, I'm trying to just fill in the gaps of what I can do to try to keep a performance arm in this, to keep them progressing so they don't totally decondition or they don't totally become unfit. And so I think part of the reason why, probably from an actual like re-injuring someone or something like that in that early phase process, is probably just because of the approach of being really mindful of what everybody else was doing. So
2 words that came to mind were, as you're describing that process, right? Thank you for just using a contextual example too, is I heard like integration, and then I just heard the teamwork aspect of it, right? And so the question I have for you is like, where did you find success integrating and collaborating, the performance with the medical? Because sometimes they work really well together, sometimes they don't work really well together. So really curious where you have found success. I've heard of success in other groups, if not your own, to do that for a return to play case where you integrate the medical with the performance, and it's a singular approach and not, okay, they're with me, then they're with you. It's like, no, like, we're here together.
Well, I think the starting point for that is probably how is each person showing up for that, right? If everyone is showing up and thinking like, this is my guy, like this is my work, this is me, like doing this, you're gonna have a problem. So I think when I have seen it be most successful is you have people that show up that are super humble, understand that they don't know everything. They understand that what they're doing is a piece of the puzzle, it's not the whole puzzle, and that in order to actually deliver a higher level product or service to this athlete that we're working with, there's actually probably some middle ground between what everybody thinks is actually a probably more optimal outcome than if I just did it or somebody else just did it. That actually we realize that by integrating all of our minds and all of our ideas into the process, we're actually probably going to wind up with a more optimal outcome to that process. So I think when I've experienced it and when I've seen it work, that's kind of a starting point, is the respect for everybody else in the room. And then outside of that, it becomes, for me, like, I think there's like a philosophical alignment, our ability to communicate with each other, and then also the ability to not just communicate, but you there?
I'm here.
What just happened there?
I don't know.
Did you hear everything I was saying?
Yeah, I got like half of it, and then he froze in a very funny face. So it's kind of quite comical. I was just sitting there like, oh, he's just frozen. This is amazing. I should have taken a picture of my screen.
You're gonna post that one up and be like, "Come have a conversation."
Yes. No. So hey, just
where did I leave off at?
Yeah, just take it from the top. I'll take it from the top and just say, the question is, where we were talking about was you had used the analogy of coming to a common ground rather than I'm the only person that has it. Like, we're going to do it my way, basically, was where it kind of left off. So go ahead and just take it away, and I'll edit it out.
Do you want me to start from there, or you want me to just recap it from the beginning?
Yeah, you can do. I'll have it from whenever we it stopped recording, so that's not an issue. So you can just start from that middle part.
Okay. So assuming that's around when, having the common ground. Yeah. I'm trying to remember what I was. Sometimes you just start talking and you're flowing, and I don't even know what I'm saying.
I know, it happens. It's all good.
Yeah. So in terms of, just the common ground of understanding that everybody that's coming into the athlete's the most important thing, right? Like, our egos or our input into the process is kind of secondary. And it's the acknowledgement that everybody that's coming into this equation to help this athlete get back, we will likely reach a more optimal solution and a more optimal return to play if we honor everybody in the room and put everybody's input into this, as opposed to just saying it's going to be me or it's going to be someone else is going to do the whole thing. And that, again, is like putting the athlete at the middle and saying, checking your ego at the door and realizing, hey, I'm a piece of this, and my knowledge and my experience is valuable to bring to this equation, but it's not the whole pie. And it's a piece of the pie. And as long as I acknowledge that, then, and everybody else in the group can acknowledge that and show up with that level of humility and respect for one another, I think that is sort of a foundation for what I've seen environments where this has worked really well and the return to play process has worked really well. And you don't run into these ego battles. And then I think maybe the next step to that becomes more our philosophical alignment, our ability to communicate with each other, and then not just the ability to communicate, but our ability to actually comprehend what each other is saying. And so I think those become very critical pieces to the conversation around what we're actually doing with someone. And the communication is important, but maybe even more important is the comprehension of each person to understand what the other person is actually saying, not just to hear them, but to actually comprehend what they're saying to each other. And so I think those are probably some of the key pieces of, if I look at all the return to plays that I've done in my career, when I have felt like it's working really, really well, not only are we working together synergistically, but the athlete is doing really well, and they're in both a good physical, mental, emotional state. all of those things are operating at a level, and there's no bickering and no fighting around things. It's more of just everyone's a part of the process and everyone has stake in it and everyone is invested with a level of humility.
One thing you said was putting the athlete at the center, and I'm curious on this take, and let me provide a little context here. In my experience in working in with some superstars over the years and working in high profile cases, there's these large teams that are involved, and there's a lot of people that can be involved, a part of the process, to the point where sometimes the athlete is leading the conversation because of the support staff or the team that they may have privately, or the fact that just the athlete themselves has been around for a long time, that they're super knowledgeable and experienced in this space because they've gone through it before. So really curious, like, where you take this question, right? Athlete-led versus practitioner-led care, right? How do you balance the two?
I mean, ultimately it's the athlete, right? Like, it's their body, and it's their body. They have final say, right? Like, they should always have final say over if someone's going to cut them open or someone's going to do something to them. I feel like for me, it's like I would always want to have jurisdiction over what someone would do to me. And in that same regard, I think when push comes to shove, if there's any choice point there, I think ultimately the athlete has to have final say, because it's their life, it's their career, it's them, it's their body. But with that, I think that where the practitioner comes in is their level of expertise. But I think underneath that has to be, between the athlete and between the practitioner or practitioners, has to be a level of trust. And so if a level of trust exists, this whole athlete versus practitioner led thing, it's actually like a dance, right? It's almost like a marriage, right? It's this dance back and forth of that conversation, where it's less of like probably someone drawing a line and being like, I'm deciding and I'm doing this. And it's more of a constant conversation around what is best for them at that time. And yeah, and it's a collaborative decision oftentimes, I think, in the best situations, because there are things where if I'm a practitioner, I don't totally understand all the pressures that the athlete is under. And if I'm the athlete, I don't totally understand what actually needs to happen to my body to fix it at like a physiological level. And so there has to be respect, I think, from both sides for that. And I think that's why there probably needs to be more of a conversation around it, as opposed to like, a dictatorship that one person is leading it or another person is leading it.
How did you help the athletes manage some of those external pressures? Because it's not just in the pro setting now. I mean, it's now even in the college setting with NIL influence. It's now even in the high school setting of people trying to get to the college to acquire the NIL. I feel like it's just the external pressures. It's not just exclusive to professional sports. So from the years that you spent there, when those situations arose where there was a high external pressure, there was a high external factor weighing on a decision or weighing on an athlete, how did you help them navigate that?
I mean, I think that becomes I mean, I guess that's where we put our therapist hat on. The one thing that I really honor and respect about professional athletes is whether people acknowledge it or not, they are super intuitive, like at the elite level intuitive. And so for me, oftentimes it became a conversation of trying to tease out their own intuition about what was best for them. And so it's posing questions to them, walking them through different things. And I think, maybe there was more times where that would happen on a medical side. But if there's ever a situation on my side, I often felt like I never was trying to give them advice. I was more just trying to ask probing questions that let them intuitively arrive at a decision that was optimal and best for them. And honestly, like most of the time when those guys, when you get them to slow down a little bit, which again, what is external pressures and stuff, right? It just, I mean, if we want to talk about brains, right? It just throws them into this high beta brainwave. And once they're in that high beta state, like they can't make decisions. Like they're so out of touch with what probably is best for them. And so sometimes just creating a space and creating an environment with questions that bring them down and create a little bit more coherence in them and create a little bit more calmness in them, is enough to get them to a place where if you ask them questions, they can navigate their way to a solution that is more optimal for themselves.
I appreciate that perspective, and I love you tying in a little bit of science there with the beta waves too. So it was great. You did.
Don't open the can of worms yet, right?
Not yet. We're gonna go there. Don't worry. We're gonna go there. But hey, you did a great job. I think it just kind of like round out this idea of return to play because a lot of listeners like are involved in that process. I mean, personally, I always enjoyed that. I think it's a fun process to be a part of. Right, just to kind of in summary here, like we talked about, kind of balancing, the local versus the global. Right, how do you maintain athletic qualities while being injured? How do you collaborate with the medical practitioners? How do you integrate with them, but also put the athlete at the front and forefront of it because that's what's most important. But then also having that relationship, like you just alluded to, of helping them manage that and navigate that whole process, even when the pressure's on. So the kind of the final bit to round out this whole process is kind of the X's and O's of it, of the end stage, something you're very good at and have extensive experience in is the end stage rehab and the training component of that. So maybe we can go global first, and if we need to go down a rabbit hole, we can. But what's like the global approach you have to the end stage rehab process?
Yeah, I mean, when someone is getting close back to, I mean, I guess we should draw a distinction between like return to training and return to competition, and I'll do this in the light of return to competition. And so I think when someone's getting closer and closer back to returning to competition, from a very high level, it becomes about, probably most importantly, replication of intensities that they're going to be exposed to. It'll always be difficult on the side with somebody like one-on-one to replicate the exact demands of what's going to happen inside of a team sport because it's so complex. And so for me, as someone gets closer and closer back to the end stage, it's contextual, like as contextual as we can get with everything that they're doing to provide all of the stimulus, not just a physical stimulus, but you're adding a technical stimulus, you're adding a tactical stimulus, a cognitive stimulus, a social stimulus. There's all these different elements to the arm of that, which ultimately will prepare the athlete to go back into the competition. And so for me, from a very high level, it's the recreation of all those different types of stress in a contextual manner. So when they go back into the competition, it's not like, well, they did enough distance and high speed running and sprinting and acceleration and deceleration. They should be able to go play in a game. But if they've done nothing contextual, it's just a different demand, right? It's a different stress on them, and they're actually not prepared to go back into the game and play, even though we've crossed all the X's and O's of the physical piece of it. So for me, I think a high level would be, that's the end part, is how do I create this end part where I'm replicating the intensity of all these different types of stress.
How does someone go to get better at understanding that, right? Because in any education model you look at across the states, right, like that level of sport inclusion is often not spoken about, right? It's really spoken like an isolation of what training is, what performance is, what health is, right? How did you grow to learn and have an appreciation for that and understand it at a high level?
I mean, doing it. I mean, that's probably the starting point. Like I'll give you an example. Times that it really started clicking or really started being like, wow, there's more to this than just running some dude and doing some physical stuff on the side, is early on in my career when I was doing rehabs and you have GPS and you have heart rate and you have all these things that you're monitoring. I would be on the side doing this stuff with guys. And, I'd be looking at all this stuff. I'd be looking like, okay, what does a game look like? What does a training week look like? And I would be trying to replicate. And I got so good at it that I knew like what drills replicated what. And I could tell you exactly, like some of the guys I worked with would be like, dude, like, what are you doing? Because I'd be like, this number's going to be that, and that number's going to be that, and this number's going to be this. And I would know what the metrics and the outcomes were going to be based on what drills I did, how long I did them, whatever my work and rest was. Like I got to that point that I was like that good at doing that. So I could literally just like program out and I'd be like, okay, I want to replicate this kind of session. And I could just pick drills and replicate the sessions. And then what would happen is I would do all that and I'd be like, this is great. Like I'm literally just like replicating what's happening in training on the side. And then there reach a point where the guy would go back into training and I would have all this data that I'm looking at. and I'd be like, this guy is like, he is ready, like he's fit, like he's ready, and I'm like, his heart rate response is like almost nothing. He's doing all this mechanical work, and then he'd put him back into training, and he would do like a third of what he was doing with me on the side, and his heart rate response would be like he'd be like he's blowing up, like his heart rate is just like redlining like the whole session. And there was those moments where like really like I sort of knew, but it was like those moments where you're like, oh, like there's way more to this. Like there's this cognitive piece, there's this emotional piece, there's this, I have to understand spatial awareness and technical and tactical. Like it's really different to sprint versus like sprint into space to receive a ball. Like those are two really different tasks. And those were moments where it really like resonated and really like sunk in that there is more of this that I have to appreciate, and I have to appreciate the context of the sport. And once I started to open that door a little bit, the way that I appreciate that more is I actually just have to learn the sport more and more and more at more depth. I need to understand what each individual player in each position goes through, what what their game looks like, what their trainings look like, what demands are being placed on them, not just from a physical standpoint, but from like an emotional and cognitive standpoint. And like once you recognize that that's a thing, it's like then just becomes a dissection of the sport to understand the sport at a deeper level, to then understand how you can marry these two things together in a more efficient or effective way.
It's almost as if you like a requirement to be not a requirement, but a qualification to be operating in that space is having the experience. Maybe it's just a short while managing some of the data from a GPS perspective, because similar to yourself, that's how I learned to appreciate a lot of fine tuning of drills and understanding physical demands, both in soccer and basketball, just physically taking the tech, tagging it, doing that hard stuff, looking at the numbers to really appreciate, oh, this is what this drill does. And to your very point, I of the stuff on the side, not replicating the stuff on the field. What was eye-opening to me in my career was when you had the second team or the reserves and you're trying to maintain their fitness, like nothing replicated the physical demands that came from a live match. Like it was just so hard to replicate those intensities, even as much as I would imagine you're a very analytical thinker, like very organized, where like, okay, I'm going to do these 7 drills and I'm going to get this player load. I'm going to get this amount of high speed running. And then you recognize, to your points, like, man, there's just so much more to it than just the physical side that impacts the overall fitness. And like what fitness is more than just physical and cardiorespiratory capacity. It's just so much more and complex.
Yeah. The human body is just a complex organism, right? And I think oftentimes most of the models that we use they're very reductionist, and at best they're complicated, but complicated and complex are real different. And so, yeah, I think it's just like, it's honoring almost the fact of like, I'm going to do X and the outcome is going to be like somewhere around Y, but it's not going to be exactly Y. But it's also why every pharmaceutical that anybody takes has like some type of side effect, because you can't just take one thing. You can't just apply one principle to somebody and expect, a Y outcome. It's not like X to Y. It's not this linear process. There's all these confounding factors that go into it. And as simple as like the load that I applied to someone will elicit a different response based on how hydrated they are, or how much they slept the night before, or if they fought with their girlfriend that morning. Like those are all factors that'll change it. And it's like you have to recognize that and realize you don't have as much control as you think you do.
I was gonna say, there's so many days I leave the training ground or leave the practice facility. I'm like, there's so much out of my control. What am I even doing here? Like you just like, you really just question, like when you have an appreciation for how complex things are, you really just ask yourself, why am I even here? Like I not saying that I know why I was there, but you just gotta question like yourself. It's like, man, like we did everything right. We evaluated every risk. We probably best evidence, and something still went awry. And you're like, man, like what was it? It's like, man, that's only 2 hours of your day with them, 3 hours of your day. There's 21, 22 other hours that they're not with you. So I appreciate the color and the the humor that we brought to that topic, because it is a challenging thing to manage at the end stage of rehab. I wanna kind of take things towards the pro sports setting and kind of just talk about some realisms that really exist in sports, which maybe if you've not lived it, it's tough to understand and appreciate. And there's always some listeners that are reaching out trying to understand, hey, how do I get into sports? How do I work in there? What's it like? Like, what more can I learn to try and get there? So I want to like kind of just ask like a laundry list of like random questions just to kind of share your experiences there. So the first one I had for you is, what were some of your top 3 favorite things you enjoyed about working in sports?
There's a dog growling and barking in the background. Sorry. Um, I mean, the top three, I mean, at the end of the day, man, it's sports, man. It's fun. Like, it's honestly, it's fun. Like, it really is. Like, it's fun to think about that I mean, in soccer, it was like you work most of the time. It's like you work and you build up for a week. And then at the end of that week, you have this like payoff. And it's like, hey, we get like, it's like a report card at the end of the week, right? And there was something I loved personally about that where it was like, I got immediate feedback on what I was doing. And so it wasn't like, I'd worked in a corporate setting for a few years after college. And it wasn't like that where it's like you do this job and then, maybe like 12 months into working there, they like sit down with you and they talk to you about what you'd been doing. It was like every week you're kind of like getting this report card and there's a lot of pressure to it. And so I actually loved that. Like I loved the fact that it was as dynamic as it was. And, this is probably my second point is that like there's a lot of pressure because at the end of the day, it's like if you don't win, oftentimes things change. And so there's a volatility to the sport, but if you don't do well with volatility, probably be a tough environment to work in. You probably feel like you're just stressed out all the time because you feel this lack of safety and security. For me, I love that volatility. Like it made it even more fun. Like I loved working in that environment. And then I think maybe like the third, maybe top, if I'm saying top 3, like the other thing would be is that, there's something really special about this group or this community of people doing something together for something greater than themselves, right? Like nobody in that room and nobody in that organization or team can win something by themselves. Like it's a collective effort. So we all have to be doing our part. And to me, there was always something like really beautiful about being a part of that, knowing that it wasn't like me individually couldn't achieve that, but me within this group doing my part, we collectively could achieve this thing together. And there's something really beautiful about that as well.
The phrase that comes to mind is you're part of something that's always bigger than you.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, and it's, if we talk about Tony Hsieh and Zappos, it's like that's one of the levels of happiness, right? And I think that there's real, I mean, we're humans too at the end of the day, right? We're humans, we like community, and like you feel like you're a part of a community and something bigger than you.
Certainly. Then on the flip side of that, what was one thing you struggled with or just didn't necessarily enjoy that much about being in that environment?
Probably one of the reasons for the last like few years I've been contemplating getting out of it was it's really just the lifestyle and the trade-offs that you have to make between working in sport and your personal life, family life, relationships, and things of that nature. I started realizing that what I envisioned for my life, actually there was not a single example that I'd ever seen in sport for 15 years of someone living an example of the type of like personal or family or relationship life that I resonated with. And so it was a realization that if I'm serious about that type of personal life and that type of relationship life, then this probably doesn't align with it. And I think that was probably, that's probably one of the biggest challenges in sport is just the sacrifice you make to give yourself to the sport and the sacrifices you make for other areas of your life.
One thing that I observed when it comes to the family life was those that had been in the league or been in sports for a long time, more often than not, if they were married with kids or just married, their partner didn't work. And I recognize that in the sense like that's the sacrifice it takes. Like that, if one partner is constantly away or at the job, like who's gonna fill that part of the family's identity of the home life. And that was just one observation I had. And as you were saying things, I wanted to just highlight that, because I'm sure you may have noticed that too when you talk about the balance in the family and the personal life. Like there's just only so much of yourself that you can give to everything. And when you're
Mm-hmm.
in season, that everything kind of filters towards the job. And I argue with myself, like, is that on me as a person? Is that on you as a person? Or is that just the constraints and the demands of what that job entails in that environment? That's just the reality. I don't know. What do you think?
It probably depends on the team that you're working for. And it also probably depends on, I think from depending on who your leadership group is, how does the leadership group prioritize things? Now, do I think that you can work inside of a sport and have a decent balance? I think it's possible. I think it just oftentimes comes down to the perception of, do people think that you're lazy, that you're not good enough, or you're not committed, or whatever? And there's almost like this badge of honor to tirelessly work yourself to the bone that proves that you are loyal to the club or loyal to the organization or something like that, and that you will give everything for them. So I think there's elements of that interwoven in it. Do I think there's a world in which you can have the best of both worlds? 100%. I think it's possible. I think that literally just comes down to, your management group and how they set the tone and set the culture of the club, or the organization, and how they communicate, expectations across the club.
What advice do you have for people that are trying to achieve that or trying to work in the sports setting? Like whether they're independent or they're coming in with a family, do you have advice for them to be successful in that space?
I mean, I think the starting point is just being real clear about like what it is that you want. I think that's like the starting point. And so, for me, there was a long time where like, I mean, most of my life I've prioritized my work and what I do over everything else. And, my friends will attest to that as well. Like there are times that, like when I lived in New York and stuff like that, my friends were like, "You're a terrible friend. Like you just never want to do anything." And at that time, it was like I would work. I would wake up at 5 in the morning and I would work all day, and I would get home and I would study and I would read, and I literally, like, it was consumed me. And then I'd go to bed at, midnight or something like that, and I'd wake up and I'd do it again. I did that for multiple years. And it was like I just made a decision, like this is what I wanted to do, and I chose to do that. But, you know, over the course of time, like, you go down a path and then you realize, well, maybe this isn't really what I want. And then you come back and you go down a different path. And so I think the starting point is just trying to create clarity around what it is that you want. If you're married and you have kids, like that's probably a bigger conversation because it's less about just you and probably more about a collective agreement about what we want our life to look like. And then I think it's just you have to accept professional sports for what it is. You have to accept that, there's a level of volatility, there's a level of uncertainty within it. And as long as you're okay with that, you'll probably be fine. But if you're not okay with that and you're trying to make sport be something that it is not, you're probably just going to be stressed out all the time, and you're probably not going to make it.
All right, let's double click on a couple of those final statements you had, because there's some good thoughts I know you have on there and some good
Yeah.
experience that you have. So one phrase that you had used to me earlier was, sport is built on competition, and that directly impacts kind of how the day to day can be easygoing or the complete opposite, high stress. Could you speak upon this idea of how everything is built on competition?
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, you're in entertainment. It's entertainment business. And so you have to get results. Like that's the short of it, and every team is trying to win. There's no team that enters the season and says, we're just gonna, we're just gonna play this year. Like we'll just, whatever happens, happens. Like we're good. Like it's every team enters the season thinking we can win or we're trying to win. And so, with that, because everything is built on competition, when you're not winning, well, I mean, I go down the road of like, everybody's traumas start coming to the surface, right? You got a bunch of people in there that, there's a thing where, we probably all get into this world, and we probably all, athletes all get into this because uh, fundamentally my belief is that there's a void we're trying to fill. And by achieving high levels of success, and I can say this about myself, like I think there's many layers where I needed to achieve high levels of success. I needed to do all these things because there was a sense of like a lack of like a lack of self-worth, a lack of believing that I belonged. And so like I had to do everything I could. And so everything was a competition. And so I naturally gravitate into an environment where it's all about competition. And so when you're winning and you're filling those voids, I mean, everything is great because you feel worthy and you feel full and you feel whole and you feel like you belong there. But if you're not winning, well, then it's like poking the beehive, right? You're poking the beehive, and it's like all of this like maybe lack of lack of self-worth, that you don't belong there, that maybe you're not good enough. All those things just like bubble up to the surface, and it just creates this like really rough environment where what do people do in response to that is they try to control everything. And so everybody's probably worked for a coach who's not winning any games, and like it's like turns the ratchet a little bit harder and a little bit harder and tries to control a little bit more and a little bit more. And it's literally just like a trauma response. And so if you understand the human condition and you understand that it's playing out inside of these organizations repeatedly on that wave of competition, if you understand that, like you can navigate that and probably not have as much of a negative impact. If you don't understand that, then you actually just become a part of that wave, and it's really hard. Like it's really stressful, and it can be really like riding a roller coaster, like emotionally, physically, mentally, in all those realms.
How how do you no, this is really important to talk about
Yeah,
because like these are the
yeah,
things you and I both know. These are the things that would make or break teams. These are the teams that make or break people
yeah,
getting fired, people that want to leave the job,
yeah,
right? Like so, right. So I struggle with this at times in my career, right? When the pressure is on or the emotions are so high, like how do you yourself stay even and not get caught up in it? Because it's so easy to get caught up in it or ride it when it's low and ride it when it's high. Like how do you just say like plain Jane and I feel that emotion. I'm going to acknowledge it, but how do I not let it get the better of me?
yeah. I have a whole bunch of techniques now.
Okay.
Um, I, I mean, one of the things I say to myself all the time though is like, dude, none of this shit matters. Like in the grand scheme of life and of this existence and of like what we're doing, like none of this shit matters. That's like honestly sometimes my starting point. And now granted, I get it. Um, Not everybody can say that. So for me, like I have different techniques, and that's where, maybe one of the big ones is if you ever heard of the Heart Math Institute.
Mm-hmm.
I have a couple of certifications through the Heart Math Institute, and this is where we start talking about like actually how do you change your physiology. And so techniques that I use are all theirs because in those situations, there's this concept where we have this like emotional battery, and we can do a number of things with that emotional battery. We can prevent that emotional battery from getting drained. We can charge that emotional battery up, and we can make that emotional battery bigger. And so I would say using their techniques, which essentially utilizes accessing like your heart, accessing this energetic center of your body to influence your state of your brain. And that the heart actually has more neurological connections running from it to the brain than the brain has running to the heart. So the heart actually has more control over the brain than the heart. And the heart actually has direct connections into our emotional centers, like into your amygdala and some stuff like that. And so how do you manage those emotional situations? How do you prevent yourself from going on this roller coaster of emotion? How do you prevent yourself from just getting completely emotionally depleted? And then how do you actually prepare yourself even more when you come across these high emotional situations? And to me, it was using a lot of those techniques I've used. I mean, you can go into meditations and there's other things that I've used, but I would say in the moment, in real time, Heart Math Institute techniques are probably the thing that I used the most prevalently over the last couple years of my time in sport. And I think those were the times where using it allowed me to actually understand what was happening in the environment at a whole different level, which is ultimately, I think, led me down the road of recognizing that there's probably a time course here where this is no longer the environment I want to be in.
So let's follow that idea, and because I've faced this question in my career. I know others in the space continually face this in their career as they're still living it. Like, how did you determine, hey, I think the time is coming? Like, when was sports no longer it for you?
I mean, honestly, probably a couple years ago. It was just, the thing that I said after I got let go was, man, like there's almost like a real existential crisis in a way where I recognized I have built my entire identity around being in this sport, and people had people had opinions of how good I was at my job without ever having worked with me or ever actually seeing me do anything. And I'm like, most of these people actually have no idea if I'm any good or not. Like they're just going on the fact that I'm still in the league and that maybe what somebody else said. And I always thought that was really funny, that people's opinion of me and how good or how bad I was like they had no actual firsthand experience with it. And so it was like sort of that crisis of like, I came out of it where it was like, who actually am I? And I think luckily I've done enough work in the last, 5, 6, 7 years where it was a little bit of a shock to me, but I've done enough work and I'd done enough exploration into myself where I could navigate through it relatively quickly. But I think the challenge, and I don't even know if I'm answering the question that you asked or not at this point. I'm kind of just going with where my thought is going. But I think that's often the challenge of reaching that point of saying this isn't for me anymore is almost like dissociating myself from this identity of this like avatar of me that I've created, and realizing that there's much more to me than just Chad that works in pro soccer in the MLS. Like there's thousands of other layers to who I truly am. And I think there was a process probably over a few years, and getting let go allows you to rip the band-aid off because you're like, well, I was going to make that choice eventually, but someone made it, like, helped me along. But there then comes a realization that I think in order to reach that point of being ready to leave is to be able to reach a point to understand that your identity is not what you do. It's much more comprehensive than that individual thing of like, I do this one job in this one sport. So I think that's kind of like the place where I can reach the point to accept that if I accept like who I truly am and what I actually am really trying to create in this world, you realize, or I realized that like that's when I started to kind of like create some, like I was able to kind of create some separation from it.
It's funny you say like someone's opinion of me is like whether or not I'm good at my job or not. Like one of our prior guests, Ben Hager, he works in pro baseball, and he was joking. He's like, man, sometimes like I'm judged on my job just on how quickly I respond to a text from an office executive, or like how responsive I am to random requests of families, when in actuality, like I'm a damn good physical therapist, but no one really knows unless you actually work with me in the day to day. It's so fascinating how maybe there's another topic we can even just hedge here is the lack of, at least in my experience, the lack when you compare it, because you worked in the corporate space, so I'd love to hear your perspective on this, is the lack of true assessment of performance versus just, oh, you're a good dude, you've been in the league for a while. Like actual, like, hey, like, no, like this is what you're being judged on from our criteria and why you're successful and why we would extend you another contract or why you should get a promotion or why you deserve this bonus, rather than your bonus is dictated by the success of the team getting into the playoffs or not, or the record of the team, even though you have no control over some of those decisions that directly impact that. So let me pause and bring back an actual question here and ask yourself, how do you think it is best to judge the success of those that work in sport? Because I think that's a hot topic too. People are always constantly trying to negotiate contracts and prove their worth and ask for the raises that they deserve or they believe they deserve, right? Like what do you think is appropriate to judge success of those that work in sports?
Probably depends on the role. That's probably one. Obviously there's an element where I understand that team success becomes success for everyone, but I can say, for example, there was a year where, one year we had so many, like, we just inherited all these guys coming off of off-season surgery. We literally had so many old players, so many injuries. And if you actually looked at the results we got, well, we were terrible. But if you looked at the actual work that we did and the level that, from a medical and performance standpoint, that we operated at, it was probably one of the best years that I've been a part of. Where I was like, God, we're doing some like high level stuff here, like, and we're doing stuff like really well, but we weren't judged on that. And so I think that becomes probably, I mean, that's where, to me, leaders of departments, within medical or performance, like when you're in those realms, like I think that becomes a thing where the starting point is, if you're running that department, you understand what good metrics are to hold your team accountable to. And I think then it becomes like the responsibility of whoever is leading the group to fight to GM, management, whoever it is, that some of the bonuses that come to that department are based off of that are based off of actually the work that you're doing, not necessarily the results of the team. I mean, that will be, to me, like the starting point for it. I mean, with the understanding that I understand if the team doesn't do well, the owners are going to be like, well, why should anybody get bonuses because we were terrible? But I think there's probably slowly a distinction that needs to be drawn between the people within the building who the work they do while will have an impact, and there should be maybe a portion of their bonus dictated on how well the team does or what injury rates or things like that look like. There's also an element of it where the work that they do is sort of outside of results and needs to be delineated. And that, to me, comes down to whoever's managing those departments and them sort of, fighting for that to be the case.
It's a great perspective, and it's a question I'm always curious on because I think everyone struggles with it because oftentimes those decisions aren't left with the people that are managing those departments sometimes. So I really just appreciate the thoughts and ideas there. I want to be mindful of your time here, but there's two big questions I want to get to, and I know where we're going to go with this one question, but we always talk about we we always talk about bringing on like success and high performance and trying to sustain success. And the expression I've come to adopt is just finding small wins, right? The name of the podcast. How are we finding those wins that keep snowballing into something bigger towards the end? But you previously, while we were talking, offered a new perspective onto the idea of small wins and sustained high performance. So I would just love to, leave an open-ended question to you, is like how you philosophically view that and how that can help our listeners to maybe reframe how we're defining high performance and success.
Yeah. So, to shed light on what I said to you offline was, when I read that question of how do we find small wins and, how do we see those in our day to day, the first thing that came to my mind as I read those questions was really just about philosophically how I approach my life now. And so I now am of the belief that everything that happens in my life, I have created it. And so I've taken this sort of element of like complete ownership over everything that were to occur in my life. And so this has shifted from this sort of victim mentality to this more of like, I have ownership and I'm proactive in this whole situation and I'm actually creating what's in front of me. And so I now believe that nothing is happening to me, everything is happening for me. And once I take that approach, and you can take this in the context of high performance, but once I've shifted that perspective, now the conversation and the questions I ask myself become about answering the question of like, why is this happening to me? What is this situation trying to show me or reflect back to me? that is basically just a mirror of my internal state. So it's sort of like a window into my subconscious of like what I really think, what I really believe. And then and that basically just tells me like, who am I being and how am I showing up in the world? And then once I sit on those questions, I then get to ask myself like, is this who I want to be? And is this how I want to show up? And so from that perspective, I am then able to make all decisions that I want to make in alignment with whatever the reality is that I want to create versus the reality that I feel like I'm just in or I think that I'm a victim to. And so it's a complete shift in my level of consciousness inside the environment. And so the idea of like the application of that of like how do you do high performance or like what does that mean in high performance is now with inside the club, everything that happens I started perceiving it not as like, oh, well, this person's doing that and this is going on over there. And I actually started looking at it as like, this is just a giant mirror. And this whole building is just some giant mirror to me. And everything that everybody says or does or whatever simply becomes like some reflection of the reality that I've created. And then because I now believe that I create the reality, I then started changing who I was to see how things around me would change and how people would then perceive me. And so it always just came back to I am the only person that can change in this situation. I don't need anybody else to change. I don't need to like criticize anyone, judge anybody else to change. The only person that can change is me. And if I change, the environment will change. Or ultimately, I reach a place where like the environment has changed, or like I have changed so much that the environment no longer aligns with me, and I can make a conscious decision to step out of that environment and move on to something else. And so, yeah, I think in every human interaction, it changed every human interaction that I had. It changed every conversation that I had. And was I perfect at it? By no means was I perfect at it. Like I still complained every now and then. I still passed judgment. I still did all those things. Like I'm a human. Like I still did it. But I would always go back to the place of like pulling myself back to the place of being like, well, dude, like you created this. Like your reality is your creation. So if you don't like something in it, then look at yourself because it's you. And so I just kept coming back to that place. And honestly, that really changed the way that not only I showed up who I was being, but it also really changed, I feel like, the way that I connected with people I worked with. It changed the way I feel like I was able to show up and do things. Um, and I think ultimately it probably led to me not being there anymore because I no longer fit.
I think it's important. I wanted to leave it open because I knew you would just crush it, which was beautiful. And but it's important. I feel like it was important to share that because I certainly have fallen victim to this in my career. Of like something goes wrong, and you get to a finger pointing game, or the fingers are getting pointed at you because something, some outcome, like you alluded to, some outcome went wrong. And I really appreciate the perspective that you said. It's like, okay, if I can look myself in the mirror and say all this good or bad is because I created it, or because it's a reflection of me, like then there has to be some element of yourself that you can try and upgrade whatever's going on in there, whatever you can do to be better, to at least elevate the situation, elevate the environment. What I also appreciate about your perspective is just like having the clarity now and the breath to say, okay, probably got to a space where that environment was no longer a fit for me, and sometimes I still want to grow, right? I still want to expand. I want to do more. And if you have to get outside of that box to be able to do that, then you have to be willing to walk away. I just think, and I struggle with this at different points in my career, is like the fear of, it's almost like there's a fear of walking away versus you just need someone to rip the band-aid off for you. And I don't know what it is, and I don't know why. Like I've talked to a few people in this space about like, why don't you just leave? It's like, man, I can't, like people think differently of me. It's like, oh, well, so just get fired instead, or get, you choose to mutually part ways if you're in the middle of a contract. And it's like, all right, well, why does that have to be there? So that's my long-winded answer and rebuttal to saying thank you for and have an appreciation for where you've gotten to and just sharing that perspective, because I think more people need to hear that and appreciate that. Yes, high performance is all around you, but there's ways to navigate it.
Yeah. And I think if the can of worms is open now, so for transparency, like if I were to be totally transparent, honest about where I feel like I fit while I was in pro sports, like I mean, I have like the deep levels of fear, anxiety, self-worth, like those types of things, like those patterns of trying to fill that void, like 1,000%, those are my patterns. And, once I just, took the flashlight out and shined the light into those crevices of myself, I see it so much more obvious in everybody else in the room. I see it in them because it's in me. And so everything, and like this is where I connected the dots of like the reality is actually just a mirror of me. And so like that became this thing where like those things started to like line up where I'm like, oh, like I get it. Like I see in this person, I empathize with this person because what I see in them is actually in me. And I have like struggled to get through that in me. And I think in that same regard, like because I've now navigated through those things and I've like, I would say healed those parts of myself and they don't really trigger me anymore. I am aware of them. Like I don't need to be in a space where I'm triggered by it all the time. Like, cause I'm like, I'm good. Like I can be here or not be here. I'm just going to choose to go somewhere else because I want to grow in a different way now. But then you're able to just see everybody in a different light and you're able to see their humanness and you're able to empathize with them at a different level once you recognize that everyone's struggle is your struggle.
Amen, brother. Amen. One final question I wanted to ask for a little bit of fun with you is, I mean, we already had a lot of fun.
Yeah, great time.
Yes. But this idea of the ability to upgrade our own, health and performance, right? This day and age, there's a lot of tech and data and influencers out there promoting a lot of things. You yourself have incredible experience and knowledge, having worked for over a decade in professional sports and also very analytical with your work that you were doing. So really just curious on this question, right? If someone wanted to make a small change or make an upgrade to their own health and performance, what advice do you have for them?
Depends on how far down a rabbit hole you want to go, but I think at a high level,
let's keep it at a high level. Let's keep it at a high
yeah,
level.
at a high level, I think the starting point, and honestly, even for me, no matter how far down a rabbit hole I go and how many weird things I might try or explore, to me, fundamentally, it always comes back to a lot of really core principle things like sleep, exercise, nutrition, hydration, supplementation. Probably everybody in the United States is magnesium deficient, like things like that, right? It's like basic stuff. And then also just creating moments of like stillness, whether it's like meditation or just like sitting peacefully, quietly, being in nature or something like that. And then I like, what's the word I want to use for this? Like choosing moments of stress, like choosing moments of discomfort, right? So like, if you do like cold tubs or something like that, right? Like you're consciously choosing a moment to like navigate a moment of stress. And that these little things like that actually allow you to elevate your health, increase your adaptability, increase your stress resilience, all those types of things. So I think honestly, like most of the time, it just comes back to really basic stuff. Like, are you doing these really basic things savagely well or not? And if you're not, then before you go and do all these like weird things, make sure that you've dialed in these foundational core things and you're doing them exceptionally well.
I like the idea of choosing discomforts because being uncomfortable is where the growth happens. I mean, that is at a physiological level how you grow a muscle. And I always remind myself that I was like, if you're comfortable, you're probably not growing. And if you're comfortable, maybe it's time to make a pivot or make a change. So I think to close this point for those that are, considering all these wonderful points that Chad has talked about, just I think the important thing to underline all that, like, it's going to be hard. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be uncomfortable, but like, just know at the end of the tunnel, there is that light and you'll get through it and find that change that you need.
Sometimes I change. So I have a pattern of like that in order for me to be successful, I have to struggle and I have to fight and I have to all this stuff. So I very recently consciously made a decision to be mindful of using the word it's going to be hard or it's going to be difficult. And I've switched that to say it's going to take energy. And so it's going to take energy for me to change. It's not necessarily hard. It's just going to take energy and commitment because in order for me to change, I have to change my energy. and I don't change until I change my energy. And so that's been like this little nuance of a shift where I stopped telling myself that story that like, this is going to be so hard. And rather, it's more of like, no, it's going to take a commitment of my energy, and it's going to take a lot of my energy. And depending on how ingrained some habit or pattern is, will determine how much of my energy it takes to change that pattern or habit.
I'm gonna start using that because I really like that. You know, my wife and I, we have this expression in our family that, hey, we can do hard things, right? That's just like, I feel like a family mantra unofficially is like, hey, we can do hard things. And we tell our kid that doesn't understand that yet that we can do hard things. But I
You're
like
already,
that.
you're basically accepting that you have to suffer to succeed.
Yes. And I like the reframing of that. Like, this is going to take energy, like trying to build a business right now and start a
Yeah,
business. Mom was like, God, it's like, we can do hard things. But it's like, no, like, this is just going to require a lot of energy right now to find the success.
yeah. And it's honestly, man, it's little shifts like that. I've made so many of them, and I should write them all down because there's probably like a lot of really good stuff in a lot of them. I've so many of them. Some of them I remember, some of them I forget, and they'll come back to me at some other time. But sometimes it's as simple as those shifts. And when you think about like, why does everyone have a child? Like, I'm on a tangent now, but why does everyone have childhood trauma? It's because until the age of like 8, 9, you're just like you're in like a dream state, and everything that gets said to you just gets programmed immediately into your brain. And so all the things that like so if you imagine like telling your child like, oh, we do like you do hard things and you can succeed, and it's like they don't actually process that. It just gets imprinted, so they have a pattern of saying like, when I get older, I just know that in order to succeed I have to like work really hard. And there's like a new model where like that actually isn't true. There's other ways to do this, that like you can be crazy successful, you can achieve things. It just depends on how you direct your energy, and it depends on like how you want to actually experience success and what you think success actually means.
Brilliant, man. You definitely need to start writing this stuff down. Absolutely. Because and what's great, what I love about our conversations is, yes, we started talking about sports and return to play, and they just always take these twisty turns and go down some rabbit
Yeah.
holes. So I hope the audience can appreciate that. Yes, this is when we talk about sports, when we talk about the work that we do, that the success is more than just kind of who we are and what the X's and O's are. So, Chad, thanks for sharing your stories and sharing your experience. But you can't get away without answering a few fun questions, man.
Yeah.
The first one being no names needed. You know, you worked in sports, man. Come on, everyone's got
Yeah.
some stories, right? No names needed. What was your favorite locker room moment?
I'm gonna keep all the like rated R ones off the podcast. Um, but I'm gonna go with a fun one. Like honestly, in sports, when you win, it's fun. And so I think, winning an MLS Cup, winning an Open Cup, like the locker rooms after that, there's just honestly just like a sense of just complete joy, because you're in a room full of people that at the end of the day, we're like kids, we're like giant kids. And that level of joy and fun and happiness and just like the sense of just like accomplishment after committing everything that you've committed to win something at that level. Yeah, those are moments, like those are a couple of moments where like I don't think I'll ever forget them, because they're, obviously like emotionally charged in a really, really good way. And I think I would probably have to say like those are probably among the top fun moments of like being in the locker room in sport, is those situations.
How about favorite city or favorite stadium or both that you traveled to, played in?
I mean, my favorite city is like I love Southern California, man. So I love LA. Like, I don't know. I feel like some people love it or they hate it. I love it. Like, it's one of my favorite places. So I could never go to LA enough times. Um, so favorite cities for sure. LA's got to be at the top of that. Favorite stadiums. I mean, Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta. That's one of the coolest stadiums I've been in. Like the thing is enormous, and when you're inside of that playing, like it is wild. Like just the energy inside that stadium is wild. But I mean, it's a football stadium though, but soccer specific, Portland's Portland's is pretty dope. Kansas City's is good. I mean, Austin's is good. Um, LAFC's was cool. Soccer specific ones, like those are probably maybe top 3 or 4 soccer specific ones. They're obviously smaller, but just like the vibe and the closeness and the energy inside of them are really, really good. But pure like size and experience, Mercedes-Benz is wild. When that I've been inside that when that thing is full, that's just crazy inside there.
Because you guys the finals were in Atlanta, one MLS Cup, correct? Was that that was the one where Atlanta won? Were you the opponent in that game?
I was not there. I was not no, the only finals I were at was in we were always in Toronto. It was literally Toronto like
Oh, that's right. That's right.
three
Yes.
three out of 4 years it was Seattle and Toronto. Like it's
Hey,
wild. There's
what?
parity in sports, but apparently sometimes there's not. Like it's wild.
That is true. That was like back in the early thousands. I think it was like three in a row. It was like New England versus Houston, something like that, as
Yeah.
well. I
Well,
forgot.
LA had it too. Like 2011. So 2011 was it 12 and 14 or 13 and 14? Yeah, I mean LA Galaxy won 3 and 4 years as well.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, there's parity, but it's wild when the same teams end up in the final every year.
Yes, I agree. It's the dynasty. We don't have to talk about dynasty here, but Chad, this was fun to catch up, fun to see where life has taken you, and also you just share your perspective because you are a deep thinker and not everybody is. So I appreciate you opening up and just sharing perspective about your experience in the sports, man. Thank you.
Yeah, man, and thank you for having me. And depending on how people respond to this, we might have to have like a spin-off where we literally just it's like an entire episode of rabbit holes.
We can make that a bonus episode where we're just going cliff diving into some deep, dark caverns here, man. But we'll crowdsource that one and see where it goes.
Yeah.
All right, dude. It was good to see you. Good to catch up. Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks, man. Appreciate it.